Welcome to the Economist in Your Ear podcast. So we're diving straight into that really complex relationship between the U.S. and China today. There was that summit in Busan, South Korea, end of October, and you heard some pretty high praise, right? One leader calling it 12 out of 10. Now, that kind of talk, it sounds like things are truly fixed, long-term peace maybe, but everything we're seeing suggests something, well, much less stable is going on. So the big question for you today is, does just avoiding a big public fight really mean these two giant economies are past the risk of decoupling? Or, are these deals just temporary moves, calculated pauses? I mean, it was definitely good news that they kept talking. And crucially, they managed to sidestep the really explosive stuff like tensions over. And that felt like a win for sure. But relying on that 12 out of 10 quote, probably not the best idea.
Oh, absolutely not. We really have to look past that shiny surface. The analysis suggests the agreement is, frankly, pretty sketchy and temporary. It leaves this hugely important global relationship built on, well, some people are calling it sand.
Yeah.
So we need to unpack why both sides actually agreed to this pause, what they were willing to put on the table, and maybe crucially, what dangerous bits are still very much active underneath. It feels like a very deliberate temporary setup.
Okay, that sets the stage perfectly.
Yeah.
So let's start with the specifics from Busan. What were the actual steps they agreed on, the de-escalation points? What did they trade?
Well, the moves were very, very carefully calibrated, designed to look good politically, maybe, but not really changing the long-term game much. So on China's side, two main things. They temporarily delayed kicking off new export control on some rare earth materials. That's a sensitive area. And they started buying American soybeans again.
Right, soybeans. And what did the U.S. give in return for those specific things?
The U.S. side agreed to hold off on more tariff increases, which had been threatened, and they paused some planned export controls targeting certain Chinese tech companies. And then you had that whole fentanyl piece, which was very visible, very transactional.
Yeah, the fentanyl part is interesting, isn't it? Because it directly links a huge domestic issue in America to trade policy.
Exactly. It was quite stark. The U.S. basically rewarded China for doing more to restrict the chemicals used to make fentanyl, and the reward. They cut a 20% punitive tariff on all goods in half.
Wow. So a public health crisis becomes a bargaining chip for a tariff cut.
Precisely. It's less about pure economics and much more about, a political transaction. And related to that, on tech, the U.S. president seemed okay with exporting some semiconductor chips.
Some, but not the really advanced ones.
Exactly. Specifically not the cutting-edge stuff, which just reinforces that core strategy of decoupling when it comes to high technology. That hasn't changed.
And bringing in soybeans. Well, that feels like the classic quick political win, doesn't it? Agriculture plays huge politically in the U.S. And it's something China can easily scale up purchasing quickly. So it gives the U.S. side some immediate good news and helps Chinese firms with their animal feed costs, too. A win-win, but maybe only on the surface.
It's absolutely the lowest hanging fruit for de-escalation. It gives a little boost to markets, gives politicians something to talk about back home, but it very carefully leaves the really deep stuff untouched. Industrial policy, IP theft, genuine market access. It's treating the symptoms, not the underlying disease.
Okay, so that gets us to the core issues. And this is where it gets really interesting, I think. Despite the positive spin, the soybean deals, what huge conflicts were just left there? Or maybe even made worse?
Well, the elephant in the room is the sheer level of protectionism that's still in place. I mean, think back before 2018, tariffs weren't really a big factor between them now. Even after having that fentanyl-linked tariff, the average U.S. tariff on Chinese goods only dropped from, about 57% down to around 47%.
47%. Just hearing that number, It sounds astronomical in trade terms.
It is astronomical. The sources we looked at call it an extraordinary level of protection compared to the world we used to know. That huge barrier is still fundamentally reshaping supply chains. It forces companies to look elsewhere, to move production. It basically tilts the whole global system away from easy trade with China. And this deal, it didn't touch that fundamental reality.
And on top of those massive tariffs, there's still this element of unpredictability baked right into how the deal is structured.
That's exactly right. The terms are explicitly temporary. Lots of key parts are up for review in just a year. That structure basically hands the U.S. president a loaded gun, politically speaking. It allows them to threaten new tariffs or other barriers really at any time over almost any issue. Imagine you're a CEO trying to plan a 10-year investment. This deal gives you zero long-term certainty. It almost guarantees instability is baked into the relationship.
And we also have to consider the mood back in Washington, right?
It's not like everyone there suddenly wants peace and free trade. You still hear policymakers pushing hard for at least partial economic separation, or de-risking, as they often call it. And the fact that the U.S. didn't budge on its position regarding Taiwan alongside these trade tweaks really underlines that the big geopolitical issues weren't traded away for soybeans. The domestic pressure against a real thaw is still very strong.
Which, raises a really important question. If we all agree it's temporary and the tariffs are still huge, are we maybe missing the point by just calling it sketchy or built on sand? Perhaps the temporary nature is the point.
That's an interesting way to flip it. So challenging that initial media framing, if both sides know it's temporary and reviewable, maybe it's not a failed peace deal, but a specific kind of tool.
Precisely. Temporary doesn't have to mean trivial. It could actually function as a really valuable risk management device. The sources frame it like this. Think modular small steps, each one tied to something verifiable, like checking customs data on those precursor chemicals for fentanyl. Doing it this way strategically lowers the risk of a complete meltdown, economically and geopolitically. It caps the escalation. It's about managing risk carefully, especially when the global economy feels fragile. It's not about finding lasting peace.
Okay. So the goal isn't necessarily to turn the heat off, just to stop the pot from boiling over right now. Can you walk us through the signaling part of that risk management?
Yeah. Look at that fentanyl tariff cut again. Economically, cutting that 20% tariff in half, it barely makes a dent in the overall 47% tariff wall. It's almost nothing in the grand scheme. But as signaling, it's powerful. It demonstrates that both sides can actually follow through on a sequence. China restricts chemicals, the U.S. adjusts a specific tariff. It proves they can coordinate, at least on these narrow, verifiable actions. It keeps the door open for talks, keeps channels alive for things like farm goods, even if they fundamentally disagree on almost everything else. It sets a kind of baseline for potential limited cooperation.
Okay, let's pivot to China's strategy then. The first thought might be that China just absorbs external pressure, like they're just taking punches. Is there a better, more neutral way to frame their actions here?
I think a more accurate way to put it is policy calibration, or maybe optimizing exposure. Yes, China's economy is huge. It can absorb pressure. But their responses aren't just passive. They seem very calculated, focusing on areas where there's mutual market sensitivity, things like rare earths or agricultural goods. They're not just reacting. They seem to be choosing where and how to push back or cooperate.
And that detail about rare earths seems really important for understanding that calculation, doesn't it?
Absolutely crucial. Remember, China had just tightened export controls on rare earth, vital for things like advanced magnets, right before the Busan summit in early October. So the fact they agreed to delay further new measures at the summit, it shouldn't really be read as them backing down completely or having a change of heart. It looks much more like a strategic pause or a deferral, and that fits perfectly with their own stated goal: improving economic resilience. They want to manage uncertainty, diversify supply chains, keep key markets open, but without giving ground on their core industrial policies.
Okay, so if the real logic here is less about lasting peace and more about buying time, maybe preparing for the next round of friction, what are the practical things, not the speeches, but the data we should be watching to see if this managed pause is actually holding?
Right. We need to look beyond the headlines at the bureaucratic and trade realities. So first, rare earths and magnets. You need to watch the licensing cadence. Are export licenses actually getting approved on time? Or are they quietly adding new, more advanced materials to the control lists behind the scenes? That bureaucratic action tells you much more than official statements. Second, agriculture. You have to monitor the actual shipment volumes compared to the big promises made at the summit. Track the monthly export data. Check the shipping lineups at the ports. Is the buying sustained? Or does it tail off after the initial photo ops? The actual flow of goods tells the real story. And finally, tariffs. Since the deal is temporary and reviewable, keep a really close eye on that tariff review process. Watch the timelines. Are any specific sectors starting to get exemptions? For instance, if you suddenly see exemptions being granted for complex things like specialized machinery or certain auto parts, that might suggest a deeper tolerance emerging, something more than just transactional peace over soybeans and fentanyl.
That gives us a much clearer, more actionable lens to view this through.
So I guess the key takeaway from Busan is, well, it was definitely a pause, and one rooted in very deep mutual distrust. But for now, at least, both Washington and Beijing seem to calculate they have more to gain from this kind of managed tolerance, this incremental approach, than from launching into a full-blown, really costly confrontation.
Exactly. Which leads us with a final thought, maybe a bit provocative. If both sides are deliberately setting up their relationship in these temporary rolling stages to manage risk and keep their options open, does that structure actually prevent the big inevitable clash down the road? Or does it just guarantee that we're going to see a whole series of smaller, maybe more unpredictable clashes breaking out sooner rather than later? Something to think about.
Thanks for listening. Follow us for daily insights into world affairs. And don't forget to like, comment, and share.